Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to the Clarineat.com podcast. In today's podcast, we talk with Michael Norsworthy of the Boston Conservatory. He shares a lot of interesting stories with us about his time as a student. He talks about his new record, and he discusses chamber music and chamber music performance. Before we get started, I want to quickly apologize for the quality of the audio. We had a few issues with the recording software, and although there was a few blips here and there, I felt that, first of all, we just talked for quite a long time. I didn't want to have to go back and use any more of Mr. Norsworthy's time, but also we just had such a great conversation that it would have been a shame to start from scratch. So please bear with the slight imperfections in the audio, and we'll make sure to get that sorted out for next time. Without any further ado, here's the interview with Michael Norsworthy. All right, Michael, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Good, Sean. How are you?
Pretty good. What's the weather like there today in Boston?
It's freezing.
Freezing. That's actually pretty warm here. We've changed places for once. So you are a very well-known international clarinetist. It's a little hard to know where to start with questions for someone like yourself, but maybe a good one to start with would be, what started you on the clarinet? What caused you to pick up a clarinet for the first time?
Well, I was a saxophone player originally. I try not to tell too many people that. But I was a saxophone player, and then it came time for my sister to choose an instrument a couple of years later, and she was much smaller than I was, so my parents thought, well, maybe clarinet or flute or something. So my uncle had a clarinet over in his closet from when he was in high school. And he brought the instrument over, and my sister didn't like it, so she decided she was going to play the flute. So the clarinet sat in the house for a while, and I thought, well, that's got to read. I mean, how difficult can it be? I already played the saxophone. So I picked up the instrument, and I started learning by myself, and I asked my grandmother to hear a particular record set that she had. She had a 5-record set of Benny Goodman tunes. And so actually I borrowed this record set from her. I took it home. I recorded the records onto reel-to-reel tape. Yes, I'm old enough to remember reel-to-reel tape. And I taught myself all of the Benny Goodman tunes that were on there, including all the solos and whatnot. And I never had a teacher originally on clarinet. But then I decided that I wanted to start taking lessons. And it worked out really well because my teacher was a doubler. So he played saxophone, clarinet, and flute very, very well. His name was Jim Hahn, and he ended up going to work for Disney.
Oh, wow.
And so after a little while with Jim, then he sent me to what he called, quote, a proper clarinet teacher, somebody who was really, truly a clarinet player and also a doubler, but mostly a clarinet player, and his name was Mike Solik. And Mike was a really great teacher for me. He really did a lot of fundamental things and worked a lot on my embouchure, and used to whack me upside the head every time I used vibrato and various and sundry other things.
We won't get into that. That'll open up a can of worms, I'm sure.
But he was a really great teacher for me. So in 8th grade, I decided that I wanted to start playing clarinet in the band instead of saxophone, and the band director had a fit, and I decided I was going to do it anyway. So I did clarinet sometimes, saxophone sometimes. I oftentimes went back and forth, and that's pretty much how I got started, and I was always a doubler.
So you said the band teacher didn't want you to switch. You must have been excelling at saxophone and maybe leading or something in the group, or?
I was leading, but there were a lot of saxophone players. I mean, every kid in the 80s wanted to play the saxophone because every 80s pop tune, as you well know, has a really cool saxophone solo right in the middle.
Well, not to mention the Simpsons coming in the
well, of course.
half, yeah.
So everybody played saxophone, and I thought I would like to play the clarinet, and I wanted to do that because I did saxophone in jazz band and things like that, and I didn't really do much classical playing, but I really liked classical music, and clarinet seemed to me to be a really good way to sort of satisfy that that longing for something classical.
Well, it's interesting though, because you say you started by transcribing Benny Goodman tunes. Is that right?
I did,
Yeah, so
yes. Talking
see.
about classical music and Benny Goodman, but Benny Goodman was really, I mean, my grandmother, like I said, had this 5 disc set, or 5 record set, pardon me. And she also had other things like Benny Goodman's version of the Mozart Concerto,
Yeah, he's
the
done all
Mozart
those.
Quintet. So it became very clear to me that the clarinet was a sort of a much more flexible instrument, at least to my young, naive mind. And you could do classical and jazz with it. So I thought it was a just sort of a good fit for me.
Well, I think there's some truth to that, even just because even if you only consider the range of the instrument, it's much wider and the tone color is different in the registers, unlike a saxophone.
Sure.
It's more, um, it's more uniform and it doesn't have as many notes, obviously. Um, so that's very interesting. But that's what got you started. What was it that kept you going? What was the driving force of music, and especially towards your clarinet playing?
Well, I, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I mean, I was I was completely obsessed with music. I still am. I mean, just about everything I do revolves around music in one way, shape, or form. And But as a kid, my mom never had to bother me to practice. I practiced when I needed to practice, and I didn't practice when I didn't need to practice. I was pretty good at sort of knowing what I had to do and doing what was necessary to get there. Um, and I think she would have preferred that I practice more and more and more and more, but that's just not the way that I ever really was until I got to college. But I kept going with music because I don't know. I had a difficult childhood, and music was always the thing that I kept coming back to that sort of, saved my life or, evened things out in my emotional roller coaster of a brain.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. In some ways, I felt like I owed it something. In some ways, I felt like, well, what else would I do? I mean, this is what I do. It became my entire identity when I was in high school. I mean, some kids had the football team or the basketball team, the cheerleading squad, or some kids were great artists, and I did music all the time. And so it just became such a huge part of my identity. And so I just couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. Even though I've done other things in my career, I've taken time off from playing and whatnot, and I was a web developer for a while. I've worked lots and lots of part-time jobs. I worked my way through school as a cook. I've done hotel jobs. I've done all kinds of different things. But somehow music was always the thing that I just kept coming back to. So what kept me going? I'm not sure whether to call it a passion or an obsession.
I like the way
I
you
think
worded that when you said that it had given so much to you, you felt like you owed it something. That's
well,
an
but that
interesting way of
was
looking at it.
that was the truth because for me, like I said, I really didn't have the easiest childhood. Growing, I was very keenly aware of the fact that they called it growing pains,
Mm.
and there was certainly lots of pains, and I'm sure lots of other people have had the same thing, but I can't speak for them. I can only talk about me.
Well, we don't
Um,
have to go into it too much, but were your parents musical? Were they supportive of your music, or
my parents were both musical. My mom was a violinist. She played in high school and whatnot, and my father was sort of an amateur musician who ended up doing things like singing in a barbershop quartet that at one point was on the Ed Sullivan Show.
oh wow.
And he always played guitar and sang, and we used to, sing around the holidays and whatnot. My grandparent, my all of my aunts and uncles were musical in one way, shape, or form. One person played trumpet. My aunt played the flute. Other uncle played the clarinet, as I mentioned earlier. But so I was always around music all the time. And my grandmother, though, was probably the person that I remember the most because my grandmother had a beautiful singing voice, but the thing that she could do probably better than just about anybody I'd ever met was she could whistle.
Oh,
Um, and she had the most beautiful sounding whistle. And she, would color it with vibrato, and so on and so forth. And she always had something like Frank Sinatra or Johnny Mathis or something going on in the background. And so I learned all of these tunes, from the time I was just a small kid. Um, and I still love listening to this stuff because it really does remind me of my grandmother. My grandmother was kind of a big deal in my life, and but she was very musical, even though I'm not sure whether she ever took a lesson on anything in her life. She did play the organ later on in life, but never around me. She always said she was really embarrassed to play in front of me.
So, what was the most important thing you learned as a student, would you say?
Oh, geez, that's a huge question. uh,
I guess all the things you learned as a student in a way.
well, geez, the most important thing that I learned as a student was that it was my job as the student not to be spoon fed information, but to come prepared to the best of my abilities using every bit of knowledge that I had and then play something. And then hopefully my teacher would take what I did and help me go further with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of students come to lessons, they've learned the notes and the rhythms and the dynamics, but they don't necessarily have any kind of a phrasing plan. They don't know anything about the form. They don't know what's going on harmonically in a piece. So I usually start master classes and trial lessons and things, and actually just lessons in general with, tell me what you know about this. Because I do want to see how much work the student has actually done, because I don't want to do all the work for them. The thing that I ask them more often than not is, what is your version of this piece like?
Mm-hmm.
Um, because oftentimes they've come in and they have done their homework. They've listened to recordings. They've score studied. They've finger practiced and play practiced and all kinds of other things. But what they've tried to do, in a sense, is they've tried to make their version sound like whatever version it is their favorite that they've heard on a recording.
Yeah.
And so, but I think for something like Mozart or Brahms or Weber or certainly something that is older and standard, and I think Mozart is probably the best example, because everybody somehow as a student wants to come in and I want my Mozart to be like this person's or that person's, and I want to know why they want their version to be like that, and number two, how is their version going to be different? Well, it's not. I want to copy so and so. Well, but we already have so and so. So why are you doing, why are you trying to do version 2 of so and so when whoever that is probably still around and, doing performances of it themselves. So in other words, what makes them special and unique? What kind of original ideas can they have? And I'm reminded of a quote that during a conversation with Boulez that I had. He told me, he said, you have to do old music like it's new and new music like it's old.
Hmm.
And I thought that was really quite something, because I hadn't thought about it that way. I had thought, there was this huge division between contemporary music and older music. And in fact, really, there isn't. So I ask students to, approach something, even if you've heard a recording or 15 or 100 recordings of it, what would your version be like? What would you do? And why would you be making the decisions that you're making?
Yeah, I think that's great. Actually, I'm reminded of Glenn Gould said a similar thing. Actually, I was talking with John Roberts, who was Glenn Gould's one of the people who worked at the CBC radio when he was
Hmm.
there, and someone asked, "Well, did Gould ever play anything that was in his own style? Like, did he improvise and write his own music?" And Roberts said, "Well, everything Gould touched was his own. Like everything he played was his own style, and he sort of refused to go with the status quo. And like it or not, a lot of people were drawn to that. And interestingly, though, now a lot of people are trying to imitate that his style. And
Yeah, imitation is the fondest form of flattery,
mm-hmm,
obviously. But, when you're talking about teaching somebody how to be an artist, What I'm trying to help the student do is to sort of unlock something special within themselves. And I don't have the keys. Um, I see myself more as a guide
Mm-hmm.
than somebody who just sort of sits there and bosses people around, telling them crescendo here and diminuendo there and breathe here and that's it. So I see myself very much as somebody who guides people, who asks hopefully the right questions at the right time, who can put things in such a way that it will you know sort of wind up with some sort of positive response or question from the student. And I think that that's one of the my favorite things about my studio is that I don't have any two players in my studio that are alike.
Mm-hmm.
They're all very different. They all have very different specialties. They all have different likes and dislikes, as all of us do. But that's sort of amplified with my own studio, and as a result, what it enables them to do, it enables them to not only learn from me, but to learn from each other,
Mm-hmm.
because it creates this community of people that are not afraid to ask questions, that are interested in growing artistically, that are respectful of other people's opinions. And so what that does, like I said, is it really creates this whole community of learning, which I find incredibly valuable, because I had this when I was at Michigan State University, studying with Elsa Verdere. There were many of us. She had a very large studio, and everybody seemed to have a different specialty. And I somehow wind up becoming the contemporary music person, which was a role that I was very happy to occupy, but I didn't want to forget about Brahms and Mozart as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to find a way to sort of bridge the gap. And this quote that I mentioned by Boulez was something that helped me with that. So, but so if there was something that I learned as a student, like I said, it was to use all of the knowledge that I had and make sure to come to lessons and to come to anything, lessons, rehearsals, concerts, whatever, with a clear idea of this is what I want it to say. And I could evaluate later and after the performance or what have you, and I could say, okay, this is what I wanted to say. Did I accomplish that? Yes or no? And is that something I would like to say again, or would I say it in a different way? Or, it really provided a very valuable sort of analytical tool for me to do, one concert to the next.
It's interesting you say it that way as well. I mean, there's a John Cage quote that I've never really agreed with. I think it was John Cage. He said, "I have nothing to say and I'm saying it." But that's not a very, to me anyways, a very sort of wise outlook on a performance. And it makes sense to me that in order to play a piece, if you don't know what you're saying, why are you playing it?
Sure. I don't pretend to understand some of the things that Cage said. Um, I
Does
he
he?
was well. I'm sure he does. I mean, I know people that know him, or that knew him rather. I never knew him, so I'm not a good person to talk with about him because I just
Mm-hmm.
never knew him. I don't know what he was like or what have you. But from the many things that I heard about him, many of his statements were sort of deliberately contradictory, or they
Yeah,
were or
philosophical.
they were philosophical. And I mean, one of the quotes that I remember is him saying that he never heard a sound that he didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps that's true, but I think many of us have heard sounds that we didn't like. So I'm not entirely sure how human that is. Maybe it's very philosophical and very interesting for the time period, but I don't know for me whether that really holds any relevance.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, move on with the questions here. You studied with Cal Opperman. Could you
Mhm.
tell us a story about working with him?
So
Sounds like there are many.
there are many. My favorite though, um, is actually the story of my first lesson. I was a graduate student at New England Conservatory, and Richard Stoltzman sent me down to Cal Opperman, to have some lessons to properly build my technique and other things. And um, so I showed up. I drove down from New York. I left at 8, or rather, drove to New York from Boston. I left at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I got there around 11:30. Well, my lesson was at noon, so I parked and I got a cup of coffee, and then I went up to the door, and there was a note taped to the door, and it says, "Dear Mr. Norsworthy, went for a walk. Be back shortly, Mr. Opperman." And so I waited, and about 10 minutes after 12, he came back, and his wife Louise was with him. They went on a walk every day. And he lived in the basement apartment. And when we walked in to the apartment, the entire apartment was filled from floor to ceiling with clarinet stuff.
Oh
Like,
wow.
barrels, mouthpieces, tools, workbenches, sheet music, books. I mean, you've never seen so much clarinet stuff in your entire life. So I sat down, and I took my clarinet out. He looked at my instrument first, to make sure that I think everything was in good working order. So I sat down, and he said, "Okay, play a chromatic scale." So I played a chromatic scale very quickly, and he said, "No, no, 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 go very slowly." So I got about 4 notes in, and he said, "Okay, you have no idea what you're doing, do you?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'm a graduate student at Richard Stoltzman's, and I've played professionally in the world for the past few years, and I I, I think I have somewhat of a clue." And he said, "Well, that's where you're wrong." So
Wow.
we began the very arduous process of build ripping you down and then consequently building you back up again, which was sort of a style of teaching. But my first lesson, I was there for a total of 11 and a half hours.
Sorry, 11 or 1.5?
11
11 and a half.
and a half hours. I arrived at noon, and I left at around 11:30 at night. And during that time, we had probably played for 7 or 8 hours,
Mm-hmm.
from books that he had written, from certain etudes that he thought were important. We did a Bach, one of the Bach partitas, from the sonatas and partitas for violin, and he made a couple of barrels for me, and he made a mouthpiece for me,
Just like that.
just like that.
Wow.
It took him about 4 minutes to make a barrel, and it took him even less time to make a mouthpiece. And it was by far the most incredible equipment that I had ever played on.
Do you still
And
have those items?
I still have them. I will never get rid of them. I have many of them now.
Wow.
so, um, so, but I left at 11:30, which means that I didn't get home to Boston until about 3 o'clock in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And my phone rang at 6:30, and I answered. I'm like, "Hello." He says, "Hello, hello, it's Mr. Opperman." And I said, "Oh, did I did I forget something at your house? I'm really sorry." He said, "Oh, no, 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 no. I'm just calling to see if you're practicing."
At 6 a.m. after just having the all day lesson?
And I said, It's 6:30, and I just got home at 3 o'clock. So no, should I be practicing?" He said, "You should practice. You should get up and you should do your scales before you go to the bathroom." And I said, "Okay, I thought, well, if I just say okay, and I agree with him, then I can get him off the phone."
He wants to hear.
And I said, "Okay, I'll get up and practice." And he said, "Okay, I'll call you back in 10 minutes."
Wow.
And so he called back in 10 minutes. I mean, 10 minutes on the nose. And I played for him for 3 hours on the phone.
This is the very
So
next day.
the very next day, I had maybe 3 hours of sleep, and that was assuming that I had gone to bed and went to sleep as soon as my head hit the pillow.
My
But
God, this
but
sounds crazy. How long did you study with him for?
I studied with him only for about a year and a half, or maybe 2 years. I mean, and it was sporadic. I mean, sometimes I would go down once a week. Sometimes I would go down once a month. I think I had probably a total of maybe 20 lessons with him or something. Um, But 20 lessons was not 20 hours. 20
20 days.
lessons was more like 100 hours.
Wow.
Um, and uh, and he was very good to me. And the highest compliment I have ever gotten is when a student who was studying with him said that they were thinking of coming up to Boston, and they knew me and and he actually said to the student, according to the student, I never heard this come out of Cal's mouth, but he apparently said, "Well, that's a good idea. He knows what he's doing."
So it went full circle.
And that for me was the highest compliment I have ever been given in my life. And so, because he was somebody who was just sort of a master teacher and not even just a teacher. He was a master mentor. I
Hmm.
mean, he made you want to do it all the time. He made you constantly want to improve. He was inspiring and he was relentless. And some people had a problem with his being relentless, and I never did because I think I was just as obsessed as he was. And he was very fond of telling us, he said, this is not my hobby. I've been doing this for 75 years.
Yeah.
And it's the God's honest truth. He had been doing it for 75 years, and it's all he did. He was completely and totally obsessed with what he did.
Must have had a very understanding wife to be having all that stuff in the apartment.
Well, his wife, I mean, he called her Wheezy. Her name was Louise, but she was amazing because she basically lived for him.
Yeah.
She waited on him hand and foot. She cooked. She brought him tools. She brought him mouth. I mean, whatever he asked for, she brought him. And but they loved each other to death. They spent so much time together, and like I said, they would take a walk every single day, usually a couple of times a day. Sometimes they would walk with a dog, and other times they would just walk by themselves. But she was an amazing woman, and he wouldn't have been able to do a lot of the things that he did had it not been for her, I think.
Yeah.
And he was always very keen to give her credit because she really deserved lots and lots of credit.
Sorry, did you say he lived in New York?
Yes, he did.
Okay, so did they live there their whole life, or?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Yep. The apartment that he lived in um, was he had lived there for over 50 years.
Wow.
So it was on West 67th Street.
So what about your time with Richard Stoltzman? You studied with him too.
I did. I studied with Richard while I was at New England Conservatory. I was there for 3.5 years. And Richard was the teacher that I sort of dreamed of studying with. He was the first real classical clarinet player that I ever heard. When I was a boy, and I remember the year, it was 1989. I was given my first CD player and my first couple of CDs, and one of them was Richard Stoltzman playing the Brahms sonatas, and the other one was the Phantom of the Opera. And strangely enough, I wound up playing the national tour of Phantom of the Opera, and I ended up studying with Richard Stoltzman.
Wow.
Um, so Richard was somebody like for me, that was just how the clarinet sounded. That was how the clarinet was supposed to sound. It was incredibly vocal and very flexible, and sometimes there was vibrato, sometimes there wasn't. But his sound I found to be very, very beautiful and flexible and, like I said, vocal. So for me, that was just always what the clarinet sounded like, and I always wanted to study with him. And I had no idea that I would study with him years and years later. But the time with him it went by entirely too quickly because I feel like with somebody that had kind of a musical mind, you could literally spend the rest of your life just learning from somebody like that. And he was very big into, it was very big on articulation and speech and always making things sound vocal. He believed that articulation, that we should have as many different articulative sounds as there were letters in the alphabet.
Hmm.
And he would very frequently, instead of the T or the D or the, the cuz or the does or the ga, that all of us would use for different articulations. He would frequently say, "Could this be like an M or an N, or could this be more, like a P, like with a pop in the beginning of it?" And it was through him, I think, that I learned how to use articulation in a really expressive way that I had not really thought of before. I knew there could be long and short and different varieties of longs and shorts, but I had never thought about about articulation like I had thought about speech. So that had a big influence on my playing, and the lesson that I learned it in, I actually had gotten thrown out of the lesson because we were doing the Copland Concerto,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I started with the faster section, bup 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 bum bum, and he really didn't like the way that I did it, and he cringed every time I did it, and I thought, oh my God, I made Richard Stoltzman cringe, um, and and finally, after maybe 10 or 15 minutes of working on it, we just couldn't get the articulation right. And he said, I don't really know what you're doing, but if you come in here and do that next week, he said, you're just going to go home. He said, so you should just pack your stuff up now and go home. And
Wow.
so I did. I was very upset, and so we had set up a time for the next lesson, and I said, should I meet you here? And he said, what? And I said, well, should I meet you here, or are we doing the lesson at your house? He said, no, 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 no. Say here again. I said, here. And what he had figured out from listening to me speak was that I actually had kind of a nasal sounding voice on particular words. And so he said, get your clarinet back out. So I got my clarinet out, and we figured out that what I was doing was I was running the sound basically through my nose when I was articulating. And so it
Hmm.
would create this sort of weird, I don't want to say it was a scooping sound or what have you, but it was certainly bright and kind of like yip 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 yip. And he really didn't like it, but we had figured out then, or rather he had figured out, that what I had to do to get rid of it was to keep the sound out of my nose. And that was sort of just another example of how he used vocal things to influence his own playing and his teaching. Um, and so that basically solved that particular articulation problem, and it changed the entire world for me because articulation was really one of the things that I had struggled with as a younger student.
Yes, so many do.
Sure, and I think it's a natural thing to struggle with because it's something that, as a teacher, you can't see on the inside of somebody's mouth. I mean, I suppose you could hook them up to some X-ray thingy, but but I find it difficult to teach. It's one of the things that requires a lot of experimentation, requires a lot of patience on the part of the student and the teacher. But I think it's something that can be taught. It just takes a while sometimes because again, you can't see it, and everybody is slightly different, obviously, radically different, probably physiologically. But Richard was, he was a little like Cal in the way also that his lessons would go on for quite a while. My lessons were never shorter than 2 hours.
Wow.
And sometimes I would have lessons every week, and they'd be 2 to 4 hours long. If they were at the house, they were for sure going to be longer. If they were at the conservatory, they were right at the 2 hour mark usually because that was when he had to go put more quarters in the meter. Um, so, um, but he was a very giving teacher for me. He was somebody that would call me from various places in the world, and there was a time that he called me once at 4 o'clock in the morning, and said, "Michael, it's Dick Stoltzman." I said, "Yeah, hi, Mr. Stoltzman. It's 4 in the morning." He said, "Yeah, I know. Could you get up and play the Mozart concerto?"
Are you practicing? Yeah.
And I said, "What?" And I'm thinking to myself, who in God's name are these people like Opperman and Stoltzman? Like, why do they do these things to me? I thought I had done something wrong. And I said, no, Mr. Stoltzman, I can't get up at 4 a.m. and practice, play the clarinet. I have neighbors. And he said, no, that's okay. He said, you can just play really, really quietly and hold the bell to the phone and I'll listen. And I said, but why do you want me to do this? He said, because it's 8 o'clock in the evening over in Japan, and you might have to be on stage right now. So he was really trying to prepare me for,
Wow.
for the way that life really was going to work as as somebody who is traveling around the world playing the clarinet. And you could be horribly jet lagged, but by God, it was 8 o'clock at night, and you had to walk on stage regardless of how badly you felt or how tired you were.
What an
Um,
amazing lesson.
it was an amazing lesson because it was so practical. Um, and I think that's the thing about many of my teachers that I valued the most, is that they were so practical about so many things, and they taught me how to look at things very objectively, and how to rip things apart, and build things back together. And I was always a little bit of a tinkerer. I liked, I have a repair shop as well. So I liked taking my clarinet apart when I was a kid. I liked figuring out how it worked. I used to work with a friend of mine who was a piano technician, and so I would help him, and watch pianos be ripped apart. So I liked doing that type of work, and I think that sort of analytical mindset of, okay, so you took it apart, now you have to put it back together, and you have to figure out how it works. That's a big part of my teaching, because I think if I can give a student a concept, or a way to sort of take something apart and put it back together, that becomes transferable then to so many other pieces. It's not just unique or special to that one particular piece. So for me, all of my teachers were really, really great in that regard. They all encouraged me to be myself. They all encouraged me to use the strengths that I had, and obviously improve on the weaknesses. But it was I don't know. I was very fortunate with teachers.
So did you play it at 4 in the morning for him, or that day?
Every single note of it.
Wow. So you played the clarinet concerto at 4 in the morning. But if I was to walk over to your stand right now, what would I find?
You would find Cal Opperman's Advanced Velocity Studies. You would find the Langinus Book 3. You would find Opperman's Modern Daily Studies Book 1. And you would
The
find
Bible.
the Bible. And you would find um, a packet. My students refer to it as the smiley packet. They are many of the exercises that I feel are sort of, the building blocks of all kinds of things, like the Vadi-Makam studies, some of the Langinus articulation studies, some Opperman things, the Close scales and things like that, sort of all put together in a little, Xeroxed packet that I have myself. I do own all the books, so I don't feel badly about making a packet for myself out of copies. Um, and I'm working on uh, Frank to Kelly's Clarinet Concerto that I'm doing in April. And then the Penderecki Sextet. And I always have some bass clarinet stuff up. I'm usually playing some Bach or Telemann or something like that. So I'm trying to find an edition of the Telemann Fantasias that I really like right now.
You must have a big music stand. That's just.
Yeah, it's one of those extendable thingies that,
Oh yeah.
so it's big enough.
Amazing. So, what is one? Well, what is the most important piece of advice that you'd give to your students? And I know that's kind of a tough question, but
No,
is
it's
there
not. It's
something?
an
No,
easy
it's not.
question.
Okay.
There are two things. So I can't say there's one most important piece of advice, um, but the first one is, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Hmm.
In other words, if you're making lots of mistakes in a practice room, that means you're practicing the right stuff. If you sound great in a practice room, you're practicing the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, don't be afraid to fall flat on your face, and then look back on it and say, okay, how did this happen, and how can I help it not happen again? So there's point number one. But point number two is, practice slowly. And I know that everybody keeps saying that over and over and over, and everybody's heard it from their teachers about 100 million times. So maybe I'm just going to be 100 million and one. But practicing slowly is the most important thing that I think any of us can do, because it prevents us from practicing mistakes early on in the learning process of, learning a new piece or what have you. And when I do things very quickly, like when I get a freelance call and I have, 2 days to learn the music, oftentimes there are mistakes. And when I have lots of time to practice things and I practice slowly and correctly and whatnot, then, oh my God, the time is just, it's used so much more efficiently. And there are so many fewer mistakes. And it allows me then to really listen to what I'm doing and to what's going on around me, because I know things that much better.
Well, and I think that applies at all levels. For
Oh,
younger
sure.
students, it's so hard to get the patience to do that. Do you have any advice in that regard?
Um, Not necessarily. I'm, I think that, many things come to us as we grow. I'm a much more patient person now than I was when I was an 18-year-old kid, and Elsa Verdere would be happy to verify that, I'm sure. uh, but I don't know whether there's any advice that I have other than, be yourself. I think the phrase that we know ourselves better than anybody is probably appropriate, because we do honestly know what works for us and what doesn't work for us. And if you have, any talent or ability or, drive whatsoever, you will you'll use the faculties at your disposal, to the best of your ability. And so I think just being yourself is fine. And sometimes, when I was a 16-year-old driver and got my driver's license, of course, I wanted to do what every other 16-year-old did. I wanted to floor it.
Yeah.
And then I got a speeding ticket 3 weeks after I got my driver's license. And well, um, you know, that that prevented me from speeding a little bit. But I don't think I would have learned that lesson had I not made the mistake of speeding in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think it's okay to be yourself, but to try to fight, to do things like practice slowly and carefully and what have you. Um, I don't know whether that's something that you can teach somebody or whether that's just something that people develop the patience to do. Itzhak Perlman talks a lot about it in some of his blog posts and whatnot. And but I think the most important thing to go slow with is all of the fundamental things. So scales, arpeggios, articulation studies, tone exercises, long tones, what have you. So all of those things I think are really important to just go slowly on. And I'm, as I say to many parents that call me and say, can you help my kid get into college? Well, no, I can work with them on the literature that they're working on, but whether they get in or not is really up to them. They're the ones that have to play the audition, not me. So I think if you and I tell them, if they want to do it, if they want to do the work, they will, and if they don't, they won't.
Yeah. So true.
And it really is kind of that simple. If you want to do something, you'll do it, and if you don't, you won't.
So, you've worked with some, to sort of segue out of the teaching now. We talked about Opperman and Stoltzman, but you've also worked with a lot of composers and conductors over the years.
Sure.
Most notably Elliot Carter, Brian Ferneyhough, Pierre Boulez, and recently, of course, Michael Finnessy. You were just recording an album. Um, is there anything you would like to share that stands out from the interactions with those people?
Well, the thing that stands out is that they're all alive, except for Elliot Carter now.
Hmm.
And it was, I think that making music is such a collaborative effort. It's not all about me. It's not all about, if it's just me and a pianist, for example, it's not all about me and it's not all about them. It's about what we're doing together. It's about how we're working together. And I think working with composers was, something that, I'm not going to say it distinguished me or what have you, but I think it was something that I was willing to do that a lot of people weren't. because they found the music very weird or off-putting or what have you. But what I saw was, or what I noticed rather, when I was a student, is when I would walk on stage to play a Brahms sonata or the Mozart concerto or something very well known in the clarinet repertoire, I would walk out and I would get to about bar three, and then all of a sudden my heart would start beating out of my chest, um, because I was so nervous.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went out and played contemporary music, the same phenomena did not occur. And I thought, well, why in God's name is this not happening? And what I figured out is when I went out and played the older composers, Brahms, Mozart, things like that, um, I was dragging behind me basically a 200-year-old ball and chain called tradition.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you know, everybody in the audience already had an opinion for this is the way that it goes.
Yeah, not to mention that kind of goes back to earlier when you were saying about making the music your own. Everyone there had an expectation of how they wanted it to be.
Sure. And I think that expectation in any kind of relationship, whether it's a musical relationship or a personal relationship or what have you, it can really be something that causes disaster if you don't know what the expectations are. Um, I think with Mozart, for example, the expectations are obviously that it's, tempos are within a certain range. Your sound is sort of like X, Y, or Z. Your, your 16th notes are even. All of that. You obviously play in time and play in tune, but with contemporary music, I found that I could still do all the same things. I still had to play in time. I still had to play in tune, but I was doing things. I was playing the same 12 notes, but just in very different orders.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gave me this tremendous amount of freedom. And then as I sort of got more into contemporary music and started doing things like extended techniques, like quarter tones or multiphonics and what have you, I thought that, that basically just increased, the palette of paint that I got to walk out on stage with, because suddenly I had all of these other coloristic possibilities that I didn't have. So, for me, at least back then, certainly not now, but back then, Brahms and Mozart was a little like black and white, and contemporary music was Technicolor.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and but the collaborative aspect of it was the thing that I liked the most, because if I had a question like, the Mozart concerto, what, Mr. Mozart, why did you do this? Well, I couldn't very well go dig him up and ask him.
Mm-hmm.
But the first person that wrote a piece for me, named Christopher Peterson, um, I could call him up and say, "Hey, Chris, what did you mean by this?" And so he could explain it. And so all of a sudden, I felt like I was doing something that was so much more authentic, and so much more meaningful. So I saw a niche for myself, and I just took the ball and I ran with it. And ever since the first piece that was written for me was in 1994, and I've worked with composers ever since. And there are some that are more special than others. Ed Carter was certainly one of them. I felt very lucky to know Carter, and Michael Finnessy is certainly another one. But again, it's not. Yes, their music is great, but I think their music is great because they're also great people.
Mm-hmm.
And that the experience of working with them was really, sort of what turned me on to these pieces. And when Michael and I have recorded this CD that you mentioned, which by the way comes out on January 8th, um, um, we recorded this CD over the course of about 10 years. And the first piece was Giant Abstract Samba, that was a concerto for clarinet and wind ensemble. And then there were four other pieces, and one of which had been written before. So four of the five pieces on the disc were written for me. Um, and um, and it was just it sort of chronicles our friendship in a way. So I get to tell a story through some of the recordings that get put out, and some of the pieces that were written for me about, this is how I know this person. And these are, I mean, some of the pieces were sort of very intimate things. Some of them were also very funny things, like Mike, Brian, Marilyn, and the Cats, or I think I actually got the word order wrong. I think it's
Y-
Marilyn, Brian, Mike, and the Cats.
Yeah.
Marilyn Nonkin was the pianist that I premiered the piece with. Brian was somebody who was important in my life back at the time. Uh, I'm obviously Mike, and the cats are actually my own cats that a recording engineer came over and recorded in my house. So they're played back electronically. So in some instances, I mean, certain things are somewhat autobiographical. In a way, they tell the story of the time when these four people, or three people and an animal, got together
Hmm.
and had a grand old time. Um, but the human aspect and the collaborative aspect is really what I like about composers the most. And I'm reminded all the time, since you mentioned conductors, I'm reminded all the time that conductors don't actually make a sound.
Hmm.
But I think there are some very inspiring conductors, and then there's some conductors who are not so inspiring. And I think the most inspiring conductors are the ones who sort of just let the players play.
Hmm.
Um, they don't try to micromanage the ensemble in a sense. They respect the fact that there are a whole bunch of individual artists on the stage that are sort of trying to come together and be collaborative with each other. And I mean, really, playing in an orchestra is like playing in a giant chamber music group that just has one particular leader. And I like conductors like Boulez. There are even some really great wind ensemble conductors that I've worked with, like John Whitwell, and other people, certainly James Levine, Ricardo Muti, so on and so forth, that have really been wonderful at just letting us play.
Hmm.
Because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to get together and play, and we ended up making great music because the conductor helped us do our job. So I think that's really the kind of conductor that I like to work with. I don't like to work with you know the traffic cop conductors who want to tell you when to stop and go, and hurry up, and so on and so forth.
They're almost like a conduit to the music in a way.
Well, sort of, yeah. I mean, they unify. I think great conductors help unify in an ensemble in a way that bad conductors can't. I mean, it's. I mean, conducting an orchestra can sometimes be like herding cats. It's not exactly the easiest thing in the world. And certain orchestras follow better than others. But I think great conductors understand what their role is. They understand how they can help the musicians. And sometimes the best way to help musicians is to either get very involved in what's going on, and sometimes the best way is to get very uninvolved and, to sort of relax and not, beat the hell out of everything.
Hmm.
So, but it's something that I've been fortunate enough to experience both sides of it, and I like those that help rather than those that get in the way. Obviously,
So let's just go back to your CD a little bit. Um, you've been on more than 40 records. Is that true?
that's true.
And two of them actually are coming out on January 8th. Would you want to talk
That's
about the other one a little bit?
sure. The other one is on Navona Records. That was a project I did through Parma Recordings, and it's the music of a composer named Carl Vollrath. This disc is called Lingering Longings. It's the second volume of clarinet and piano literature that I've done of Carl's. And Carl was a composer that I met at the recording session. I had spoken to him a little bit, but he's at Troy, Alabama, and at the university down there. And he's a wonderful guy. He's 84 years old or so. He writes music prolifically. He's written hundreds of clarinet pieces, and I highly recommend them for younger students, um, because I think they're easy to understand. They're easy to put together. They're chock full of really great content, and whatnot. And so I recommend them highly. But so we did this disc. The pianist is Yoko Higino. She's a pianist that I work with here in Boston. We recorded the disc in 3 days, and it's just it's a smattering of pieces that were written for Timothy Phillips and his family. Tim is the clarinet professor down at Troy University, and so it was sort of an interesting peek into somebody else's family life with Tim and his wife Trina, their dog Casper, after Casper Mouthpieces, of course. Um, and so it was an interesting peek because things like there are a couple of tracks like Christmas time, Thanksgiving. There's a track. There's a one of the movements is about their dog Casper. I think it's called Casper on Parade, um, and other things. But they're all very cute pieces that sort of, again, it's like looking at a Polaroid of somebody's life. Like, here's this little snapshot of what was going on, or what Carl witnessed, and he sat down and he wrote a piece about it. And it's a very, very cool thing to do. I'm very grateful that I've been able to do two records of this music because I think it's just terrific. And I wish that, I hope that through the records people will actually get to know Carl's music a little better.
So that's all. You must be very busy with that stuff right now. Are there any other albums in the works, or?
I just finished recording an album of all American recital pieces by Robert Beezer, David Gomper, Joseph Schwantner, Lucas Foss, Derek Bermel, and I think that's it. So there are 5 or 6 pieces on the disc. That's on the editing floor right now. The rough edits have been made, and so we're doing that. We recorded with the Boston Modern Orchestra Project. I'm the principal clarinet player there. Um, we do recording all the time. And so usually there are several discs that are in the works at the same time. We probably release, I'm going to guess, somewhere around 10 discs a year,
Oh my God.
actually. We've released over 50 discs so far. And I think a good 40 of them are actually on our own label. And I say our, it's certainly not mine. I'm just a member of the orchestra. But I'm very, very proud to be a member of this group because we were just named Musical America's Ensemble of the Year.
Wow,
We,
congratulations.
yeah. So, well, congratulations to Gil Rose, the conductor and director of the whole thing. He's really steered the boat in such a marvelous way. And I'm very, very grateful to work with a group like this. But so there's that, and we have multi Grammy nominations and all kinds of other stuff, and it's really been such an adventure doing things with this group, and many of the things that we actually do in concert we also put down on record. And so
Like
we're
live CDs, you mean?
with some are live CDs. Most of them are actually studio recorded. I mean, we record in really great concert halls like Jordan Hall in Boston, Mechanics Hall out in Worcester, the Disler Center, Disler Hall rather at the Tufts University Arts Center. And some, like I said, are actual live recordings because the performance went particularly well, and the composer likes the fact that this went well, and there's a really nice continuity to it. Sometimes continuity can be a difficult thing when you're chopping up and editing things, um,
Hmm.
but um, but most things that we've done, I'd say, are probably studio recorded, and properly edited and whatnot.
So
Um,
those 50 discs that they've put out, is that in addition to your 40 other CDs you're on?
No, those are part of the catalog. I haven't counted.
Oh.
I'm on over 50,
Oh wow.
50 CDs, and chamber and solo stuff or whatnot. I think the number is somewhere around 10 or so. A lot of the recording that I have done is actually with BMOP, and BMOP does mostly orchestral things, but we do have several chamber music discs out as well. Things like the disc by Eric Moe, actually, that's mostly chamber music. And then the same thing with a composer named Reza Vali.
Hmm.
That's also mostly chamber music as well.
So that's a lot of experience in the studio. Is there something that stands out as being memorable, or a lesson that you learned that was most valuable, or something you could share?
The thing that I had to learn was it actually made me more nervous playing for a microphone than it did for an audience. And what I had to learn how to do was just sit down and play, and not worry so much about the microphone because, there was somebody there who was going to help you fix certain mistakes, obviously, on the editing floor. But in order for a record to sound great, it has to sound like a performance. It can't sound like somebody walking on eggshells just desperately trying not to make a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And so I sort of learned, how to go for it, time and time and time again. I mean, we would sit down and we would do the same passage 10 times in a row, but number 10 had to have just as much energy as number 1, because you might use a couple of bars from take 1 and a couple of bars from take 10 and a couple of bars from take 3, 4, or 7.
Yeah.
Uh, and so, you have to play with such a tremendous amount of energy. And by the time by the time we're done a session, I think every player in the room is pretty much exhausted and, sort of cross-eyed. And we recorded the John Adams Chamber Symphony and his second piece, Son of Chamber Symphony, and we did that in a 10-hour block, from 12 noon until 10 o'clock at night. And by the time we were all done, none of us could see straight.
Wow.
But it was so much fun.
For that kind of stuff, are you guys recording? If you're in a hall, I mean, there must not be any isolation, so everyone plays for every take?
Everybody plays for every take.
Do you ever record in isolation?
No.
Interesting.
Nope. Absolutely not. Nope. I mean, we're quite honest with the recordings that we do. The only time that there might be any isolation is if there is an off-stage part,
Mm-hmm.
or if there. I remember for the Steve Mackey album Dream House that we did, which is possibly my favorite record that we've done. But there was a guitar quartet, and the guitar quartet was actually in Amsterdam. And so we played and we recorded all of the orchestral stuff, and then they did overlay the guitar quartet stuff simply because to have them over to the States and put them up in hotels and all this other stuff would have been so prohibitively expensive. So that's the way that we did that. But that's a real rarity. I mean, most things are done, just live in a concert hall. So, and yes, we hang multiple mics and whatnot, but the majority of things I think probably comes from just the main stereo pair that's sitting right in front of us.
It's so interesting because in pop and jazz, it's almost completely the opposite.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is. And I think with classical musicians, we're so used to getting on stage and making all of the adjustments ourselves. And I'm not going to say that pop musicians don't do that, because I think many of them certainly do. But when it comes to making a record, they want much more finite control over things after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
But classical musicians, I think we want finite control over everything sort of all the time. And you can't. I don't know. I did the very first thing I ever recorded in a professional studio. They wanted to do things in isolation, and I found that so difficult because I was sitting there with a pair of headphones and the piano was being piped in, and I just had no idea how to respond in any kind of a natural way because I couldn't tell how loud the piano was. I couldn't hear the resultant harmonics from the piano. There were so many things that were just wrong with the way that I'm used to playing. And so for me, that type of approach is just not a helpful thing at all. And every musician that I know that's a classical player that has tried to record that way usually ends up not liking it,
Hmm.
because it's just not what we do.
So that's a fairly involved answer to, working with conductors kind of from before, all the stuff in the studio we were just talking about. Um, what role does working as a chamber musician play, do you feel, in a musician's development? It seems to be something fairly dear to your heart.
Sure, because I think that all ensemble playing, whether it's a large ensemble or a small ensemble, is essentially chamber music playing. I think chamber music and studying chamber music in school really was the thing that taught me how to listen. to things, because I don't think I was the best ensemble player when I was a younger player. All I had experience doing was playing in bands basically until I played in the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra, and then all of a sudden I had all of these extra things to listen to, and I had never really sat next to a bassoon or anything, so
Mm-hmm.
it was a strange experience. But I started doing the woodwind quintet during that year that I played with the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra, and as a result, I think my listening abilities got better, my pitch matching abilities got better, my cueing abilities got better. I was just I think it really helped me improve how I was able to communicate what I was doing, and to listen and to look at what others were doing. So even though, yes, we have conductors and whatnot, I mean, if you talk to any string orchestral player, I can tell you that they're probably looking at the concertmaster before they're actually looking at the conductor,
Mm-hmm.
because that's how you make sure that 30 people play at exactly the same time. Is one person sort of leads the way who is actually playing the instrument. So, but chamber music, I think, is it's critical. At the conservatory, we have a very rigorous program. We require chamber music for the undergrads for the second, third, and fourth year. So they get 6 semesters of playing in different groups of winds and strings and pianos and brass and what have you, percussion as well. Um, so I think it's critical for developing certain skills that every student needs in an ensemble, and it's just it's a much smaller way to start to develop those instead of having to listen to 15 different instruments. You start with maybe listening to 3,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of figuring out, okay, this is how the viola works, or how the trombone works, or how the this works or that works, and you sort of get to know the personalities of each instrument, and then you can take that and carry that into the larger ensemble like the orchestra or chamber orchestra or what have you, and you're just that much more informed with, okay, I know how this works, and I know how this instrument sounds and what kind of harmonics are coming out of it. So it really helps you just learn how to listen better. So for me, it's critical, and I encourage my students to do as much chamber music as they possibly can.
Speaking of your students, is there any particular tip that you give them for collaborating with others or advice that you can provide?
Sure. I try to remind my students that everybody is at a different level, even if there are two, quote, professional players. Um, there are different things that are important to each person. So, in a sense, everybody is working on a different level. So I think that it can be very useful in a chamber music setting to sit there and not say a word and to try to do the things that other people ask for. I think it could also be interesting to be the one who maybe runs the rehearsal at one point or another. It could be an interesting experience to be, just one voice of many with a whole bunch of people talking. Um, but I think that I tell my students to try to be patient, and to try to find people to play with that are really a good fit. And also, I think probably the biggest thing I tell them is not to take things too personally. Because if somebody says, hey, this seems out of tune, can we work on that? Somehow the musician always cringes a little bit and thinks, oh my God, they're pointing the finger at me. Well, no, I mean, pitch and tuning is a collaborative effort. It takes 2 people to play in tune.
Well, and
Um,
sometimes it's just an element of experimentation. Something like a
sure,
clarinet and a violin, for example, are so different that you have to spend that time and maybe sort it out.
sure, exactly. Um, And the clarinet can be difficult chamber music wise also because we don't use vibrato traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
I do. I think that it's a little a little crazy not to use vibrato at certain times because I think it's a really wonderful colorative tool. But we don't use vibrato. We get only the odd numbered partials and the harmonic series. And so there are a lot of things that make the clarinet quite different in some kind of a chamber music setting. Different from the other winds insofar as when we play softly, we go sharp, they go flat. And then vice versa. When they play loudly, they go sharp and we go flat.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really it is a big experiment. I mean, the chamber ensemble is sort of a giant petri dish for okay, let's see what comes out of this. Um, but it's fun, and I think having fun, remembering why you got into music in the first place. Presumably, you got into it because you liked it, and you liked working with other people and making really beautiful things happen. So I think that those are the things that I remind my students about the most. That hey, you like doing this, and you're good at doing this, and you're really making beautiful things. So let's try to leave the frustration at the door.
Well, it's interesting you say all that because of course, this interview is not about me, but I remember from my own beginnings in music that I was always in like marching band or school band or whatever, band. And it wasn't until university I first played chamber music, really. And I was also I was blown away by the amount of listening required, and also what I heard when I did listen. In that
Sure,
sense, it's and then you can apply that back to the band situation.
for sure. I was, I, for me, again, it was such an eye-opening experience. And then I thought, oh, this is great because then I can use this knowledge in just about every single area that or every medium that I play in.
Hmm. So many younger groups too. I've noticed that it's almost like the party where people are whispering and then everyone's talking and then everyone's yelling and you still can't hear anyone. Um, and the band can sound like that too. And
That sounds like college.
yeah, but to tell a young student especially to listen across the room and really get into what the trombone is doing, they maybe haven't thought about that. And but that applies all the way up to all levels of music. Really, you've got to be there for it.
Well,
So.
sure. And I mean, I've learned so much about my own instrument and how it functions by talking to people that are not clarinet players, by talking to bassoonists or violists or bass players or percussionists or what have you. So, I never underestimate the value of learning from people that don't play my instrument, number one. But number two, I recognize that these are the people that I have to play with, that maybe I'm not going to play with any other clarinet players, but I am going to have to play with all these other instruments.
Hmm.
So it's important for me to figure out what their perspective on things may be.
Well, and the nature of chamber music is, and I would argue, I'm not sure if you'd agree, but it also is a bunch of soloists in a way. I mean, everyone is very exposed and has to be extremely competent.
Sure. I mean, I think about chamber music. Well, I think about music making in general, like I think about cooking. Um, and I love to cook. First of all, I'm a good cook. I wouldn't say I'm a great cook, but I'm a good cook. And I think about cooking in the following way. I mean, if I'm making a pot of soup, I make the soup and I chop all the stuff up and I make have my ingredients ready, and I put it in, I put it all in the pot and I let it cook for a little bit, and then I come back and I taste it. So this is very much like practicing and rehearsing for me. So the tasting is okay. So this is the evaluation of what I just did in my practice session or rehearsal. So I tell, okay, it needs a little salt. Okay, so then I know I have to go back and practice this or practice that in a different way, or what have you. And then I come back and I taste it again. And eventually you arrive at something like, yeah, okay, fine, I could put that on the table and eat that. So eventually you'll arrive at something that, okay, this is, let's go try this in a concert and see how this works. But it's, thinking about things like this for me makes the rehearsal process a lot more fun. I like rehearsing a lot more than I like performing,
Hmm.
um, because I think that there's so many possibilities in rehearsal, and with performing, you sort of, I mean, you walk out and you get to do it once and there it is. And that's, I think, part of the reason that I was never a painter, because, or an artist in any other mediums, because I didn't like the fact that that I could finish a piece of work and then hang it on my wall, and there it would be for all eternity.
It's
And that's
interesting you say
incidentally.
that, though. Sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting you say that because you're so into recording albums, which to some
Exactly.
extent.
Well, exactly, and that's exactly what I was about to
Oh,
say.
sorry.
No, that's fine. Because making a CD is sort of like that. And so I've gotten very critical about, I really want things to sound as good as they can sound. And I suppose that CDs are kind of a necessary evil, in that way, because you want people to hear your work, you want people to hear the composer's work. It gets put out into the world in some way, shape, or form. But really, those who are listening, that are learned listeners, they recognize that you're doing this on one particular day. And you know for me, it really is kind of a snapshot of, okay, this is the kind of day I had on that day.
Well, and
um,
that can be music's different too because just because you've laid it down on record doesn't mean you can't play it again and rehearse it again and tour it or anything like that. You
well,
can
sure.
recreate that for people live if you choose.
Well, you can, and you can also, just because you made one record of something doesn't mean you can't make another.
Yeah.
You can always make another. I mean, Mr. Stoltzman has multiple recordings of the Copland Clarinet Concerto out, and various other pieces as well. And they're very different.
Well, the different collaborators would, at least be enough to make a new record of the same piece.
For sure. And so I that was the biggest hurdle for me to get over in the recording process was, oh my God, this is going to be, permanently put down on something. And that was like the painting that was finished that would get hung up on the wall. And I just hated that idea.
Mm-hmm.
But the same as many people don't like to have their picture taken. For example, I'm not crazy about having my picture taken because, I don't know, maybe I'm having a fat day or something. Maybe I'm not in the right headspace to look at myself in a photo and say, oh God, what was I thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Why would I wear black and blue together and look like a bruise?
So, Michael, is there somewhere people can find you online? I know you have a website. Is there a Twitter handle or a Facebook page as well? People should.
Yeah, there is. I mean, my website is michaelnorsworthy.com. My Twitter handle is mnclarinet, and my Facebook page is mn.clarinet. So you can find me at all those places. I do have a LinkedIn profile as well. I have a YouTube channel. All of those things are sort of constantly in flux and being updated, and whatnot. But I'm very reachable via social media, and I'm pretty communicative.
And what about your latest discs? Are those available on, I think you said CD Baby on Amazon?
Yeah, CD Baby, for the Finesy disc, and then they will they're both distributed by Naxos, and so they'll be available on Amazon, iTunes, and all of the other electronic things that you can imagine.
Oh, so
And
you
that's both
are
for yeah,
iTunes and all that too.
yeah, that's both physical distribution and electronic distribution.
Okay. So one more thing I should quickly address for the listeners. Some people had submitted questions. Honestly, I feel we have addressed all of them through this lengthy conversation that we've had. Um, I think we had so much to talk about. We could almost do a round two. So if you do, I don't know how you feel about that, but um,
Sure, it's fine.
if you do think of anything you'd like to ask Michael, go ahead and post it there on the Facebook page at clarineat.com. Also, Michael has agreed to provide us with a copy of the Finesy CD entitled Wham. And were you going to sign that copy of the disc for us, Michael?
Sure, why not?
Great. So that's a really interesting collectible item for one of our listeners to win. And to be eligible to win that, you've got to like our Facebook page. And you can also like the Instagram account, the YouTube. We're going to include all the social media elements and then draw randomly from that. So one lucky winner will have that shipping covered to their door anywhere in the world. Um, so thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Michael. I think we had a really, really interesting conversation. I know it was long, but we covered a lot of really great stuff that hopefully people had the patience to stick around for. Is there anything you'd like to close with?
No, other than I think what you're doing is a really great thing, and I hope a lot of people will listen, and I think you're providing a nice service for the clarinet community. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And I think I'd love to have you back. We should make this part one of two, perhaps.
Sure, that'd be totally fine with me.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks, Sean. Have a good night.
To be eligible to win product mentioned in the Clarineat.com podcast, you can follow us on 5 forms of social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and SoundCloud. The winners will be pooled from those 5 sources. If you find that you're enjoying the podcast, you can support it in 4 ways. You can follow and interact on social media sites, including Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can follow the podcast itself and post positive reviews on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. You can discuss and share content on your own blog, podcast, or social media with your friends, colleagues, students, and family. Or you can support it directly by purchasing your new and neat clarinet products from the Clarineat.com online store at clarineat.com/store. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.